While we've got the next slide deck up. This is the presentation that I think will help connect the dots on possibly one of the strategies that the potentially new alliance. This is so important because we've invested in a feasibility study with multiple cities, multiple entities when we hired Interra a few years ago, and the validity and feasibility of these strategies in aquifer science and understanding for the purpose of storing. The person who's done that then was hired by both our good friends with WCID #1, I'm going to let him tell that, and our good friends at the City of Temple. I bring to you Neil Deeds, and I just give him a little bit of credit here. He's the Principal Water Resources Engineer for Interra Incorporated. He specializes in innovative groundwater strategies, especially aquifer storage and recovery. Neil, glad to have you here. And there should be.
Got it right here.
Oh, gotcha.
Thanks, Dirk.
Take care.
All right, I'm a little more vertically challenged than Hal, so let's move this guy down here. When I asked Dirk, when I was going to speak today, he said you were after lunch, and I was a little worried about that because I'm not a very high-energy speaker, and then I asked who I was going to follow, and he said, well, Hurricane Hal, and I thought, man, was I going to suffer in comparison to that. So I guess I'm going to ask for a little bit of grace from you all because I'm not going to be able to do as well as he did. I always love listening to Hal talk. But I would like to say that, as Dirk said, there's going to be some science in this talk, but I think I also want to have a message of hope that this is one of the potential strategies that we can use to help with the water needs that we're seeing in the county. All right, so this talk's called The Tale of Two Trinities, the potential for aquifer storage and recovery at two sites in Bell County. So as an outline, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on ASR. A lot of you all already know what aquifer storage and recovery is. So I'm going to be fairly quick with it, but for those of you who don't know, I'll give a little background. And then I'm going to talk about two sites that we worked on. One of those sites is in Fort Cavazos, and that was a characterization study. That's because we didn't know very much about the aquifer at the time. And the second site is southeast of Temple, and there was a hydrogeologic assessment, and basically I'm going to talk a little bit about the well performance and what kind of potential we might have for storing water in and around that area in the future. I did want to mention that both sites were initially vetted in the countywide ASR study, and that was led by Clearwater and by Judge Blackburn, and I want to mention that because that study was so important in setting the stage for these more specific, site-specific studies that we're doing now. And so it was really great leadership, great vision on Dirk and the judge's part. Okay, some acknowledgments. I think it's important to do these acknowledgments because it gives you all an idea of how many entities and how many people have come together and rallied around this potential strategy and put their money and time in order to prove out the science at these sites. So first for the Fort Cav ASR characterization, we have Fort Cav, Fort Cavazos, Bell County WCID #1, the district here, Killeen EDC, City of Harker Heights, City of Copperas Cove, and the Cove Chamber. And so I want to obviously give a shout out to Dirk and Rick of WCID #1 for going out and really rallying people around this study. It cost more than $500,000 to do, and so that's a lot of money for an unknown thing because we really didn't know what we were going to find, so it's a big ask for folks. And then for the Temple, Rowan, Lower Trinity well, I want to thank City of Temple and Rowan, and then Billy Gamblin, who is at least, oh, he's out there, he's in the back there. So this was Billy Gamblin's well. He's the lead engineer, so I don't want to take credit for it. I was just kind of along for the ride, helping out the City of Temple and kind of keeping an eye on things, so I'm going to talk about it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ASR, so aquifer storage recovery. So it's a very simple concept, basically using your well in reverse. So when you've got some extra water, instead of you pulling water out of the aquifer, you're putting water back into the aquifer. Simple concept, right? I've got extra water, I'm going to put it back down in my well, and that way when I need the water, I can pull it back out. So the definition in the TAC is the injection of water in a geologic formation, group of formations or part of the formation, capable of underground storage of water for later retrieval and beneficial use. And so if you look at that diagram, what's happening is that when you put your recharge water in, and maybe that's treated water from a wastewater treatment plant, from surface water sources, it could be from a groundwater source, but what you're doing at that point is you're putting water into the well, and what happens is that water displaces the native groundwater. So you're creating this sort of ring, or what we call a bubble, around the well of recharge water. So that recharge water generally stays pretty near the well, and obviously that comes down to a lot of things that have to do with the aquifer and how you design it, but in general it stays fairly near the well. So when you start pumping on that well again, the water you get back is the same water that you put down the well in the first place. So the water from your treatment plant went down into the well, you pull the water back out, it's that same water from the treatment plant. And if you designed it right, the water is still going to be of the same quality. So that is the goal when we're doing these kinds of systems, is to not have a lot of mixing between what we're putting in and the native groundwater that's being displaced towards the edges of that bubble. And I know if it's a new concept, maybe that's a little kind of hard to wrap your head around, but that's what we're trying to achieve. So this is an operation example, so I'll just kind of take my time and work through this. So on the right-hand side, what we're seeing there at the very top is precipitation. So you can see it's wet for a while, it's average for a while, it's very wet for a while, and then it's dry. And so what happens is that blue curve is that you've got a lot of water availability when it's wet or very wet, but when it's dry, your water availability goes down. But of course, what happens when it's dry? Your availability goes down, but your demand goes up, right? People want to use more water when it's dry when you don't have water available. So the idea of this storage technology is that when you do have water available and you've got excess water available, you're going to be putting water down in your wells, in your well field, and you're going to be storing that water when water is available, and when it gets dry and everybody needs water, you can pull that water back out. So it's like a bank account. You put money in when you got a little extra money, and when times get tough, you pull the money back out. So the concept's fairly simple. The engineering is less simple, but it's definitely doable. And so the whole idea of what we were doing here is trying to figure out at these two sites is, can we use the aquifer as a bank account at those sites? Is it feasible? Is it cost effective? Is it going to serve the needs we're looking for? Okay, before we launch in and talk about the sites, I did want to talk about ASR safety. I had a question. I was talking about ASR at this symposium last year, and I had what I thought was a very good question from a gentleman. I don't know if he's here today, but he was concerned about us putting water into the aquifer and us damaging the aquifer. So you have to be really careful about the quality of the water that you're going to put in the aquifer, right? And the federal regulation standard is non-degradation. What non-degradation means, and again, hopefully you didn't have to bring a dictionary to this talk, but what that means is that you can put water in that is of as good or better quality than the native groundwater. So you can do no harm. You have to put in water that's as good or of better quality than the native groundwater. That is one of the protections. And then the TCEQ not only promulgates that rule, but they also ask that you demonstrate hydraulic control, which means that you can demonstrate to them that that water you recharge is not going to come off your property and get under somebody else's property. So you demonstrate that. And you also have to demonstrate to TCEQ that you can recover the water that you recharge. And that's called recoverability. And both of these are conditions of a permit that TCEQ grants for ASR. So there are protections in place for the aquifers, and we're always thinking about aquifer safety. If you're a well engineer or you're a hydrogeologist, we're always thinking about aquifer safety when we're doing these projects. I'd be happy to answer any other questions y'all have about that if you have concerns. All right, study area. You all know where you live, so this was really for a different talk, but we're here in Bell County, and both of the sites were in Bell County. One thing that you could look at on that map that you may not know is how large the Trinity Aquifer is. A lot of you have wells in the Trinity Aquifer, and it doesn't just exist in Bell County. It's that entire hatched green area that's in the little circle there and extends all the way to the border of Oklahoma. So it's the largest aquifer by footprint in Texas, and there's some argument about that versus the Ogallala, but by footprint, the largest. And so it extends all the way up that way and extends also down to the south, and it extends to the west as the Edwards Trinity Plateau. So the part we're in is called the Northern Trinity. And the characteristics of the aquifer, because it's so large and has such a large area, the characteristics vary a lot across the state. And we're just talking about a couple of sites that are in the same county, and we're still going to see a lot of variation in the characteristics. So that's why you got to kind of look close and do the science before you assume something's going to work. All right, so these are the two sites. So you all probably know, or many of you know, where Fort Cavazos is. The site was on the eastern part of the fort. And then about 16 miles to the east-southeast, we have the site which is southeast of Temple. So y'all recognize that loop that goes around Temple. We're just outside that loop to the southeast for that second site. And you'll note from that figure that basically the aquifer is dipping from west to east, which means that you have to drill deeper and deeper. The further east you go in the county, you got to drill deeper and deeper to get to the aquifer. No matter if you're getting to the middle Trinity or the lower Trinity, you got to go deeper as you go east. And so on the western site in Fort Cavazos, we're looking at about 1,000 feet deep. On the eastern site, Temple, we're looking at about 2,500 feet deep. Now, why is that important? Well, the first thing is that if y'all have ever drilled a well, what does the driller say to you? It costs about X number of dollars per foot, right? 25 bucks a foot, 30 bucks a foot, maybe it's 50 bucks a foot now. It doesn't seem to get cheaper, and it's been getting a lot more expensive lately. Y'all know that too, right? I drilled a well pretty recently, so I'm feeling the same thing. So the cost is going to go up from west to east. Now, that's not the only thing you're thinking about, because well productivity is really important, and we'll talk about that as well. So this is a cross section. So this is going along that exact same line from west to east, is left to right. And what I'm showing there, those two white cylinder-looking things, are two example wells at the two sites. And what you can see from those is that as the aquifer is getting deeper, the units are also getting thicker. So the aquifer gets deeper and thicker from west to east. And what does that mean? Well, you do have to drill deeper to get to it in the east, but you also have more aquifer to work with. And the more aquifer you get, generally, the more productivity you're going to get, all things considered that are the same. And so as we're going from west to east, we get deeper and we get thicker units and more potential for productivity. So at Fort Cavazos, we're 1,000 feet deep. The aquifer is relatively thin. As we get to Temple, the aquifer is very deep, about 2,500 feet, and it's thicker. So at the Fort Cavazos site, there weren't any wells nearby, and we had to go drill some test wells to figure out whether we were going to make the kind of water that would make it a viable project. So that's what we're going to talk about next. All right, this is a site map. Again, we're in the eastern part of Fort Cav. Basically, the most important thing we were told is do not park on the tank trail. They said if you had a vehicle on the tank trail and a tank came by, the tank would not notice the vehicle, but the vehicle would certainly notice the tank. And so we were very careful to not block that. Another reason that we're testing in this area is because WCID number 1 has a large pipeline to the north. And so it's a place where we have treated water that's very accessible. So if the fort through WCID number 1 has some excess water in the winter or in times when they don't have high demands, we have treated water available to recharge should the aquifer be feasible in terms of developing a project. Basically, we drilled a couple of wells, first a monitor well, and then if the monitor well panned out, then we're going to drill a production well. So again, the whole thing was about $500,000, so we were doing it step by step to make sure we weren't spending money we didn't need to. All right, so what were the fatal flaws that were the potential for this monitor well? Our first potential fatal flaw was that the aquifer we were looking for wasn't present. And we were going for the formation called the Hostin Formation, and we thought, well, it may or may not be present. If it's thin, or it's deeper than expected, or it's thin, it doesn't have the kind of productivity we needed, then that was going to be a fatal flaw. Luckily, we found the Hostin, and it was about 60 feet thick. Now, 60 feet is not that thick for an aquifer, but we were thinking still thick enough. The second potential fatal flaw was it's all clay. Y'all know if you've had a well drilled, driller's not looking for clay, he's not looking for shale, he's looking for sand, right? And we're doing the same thing. We're trying to find out whether that formation is sandy. It turned out the lithology in Ahostan had a very high percentage of sands, and so we were in good shape there. And then the third was the static water level was potentially too deep. If your water level is too close to the top of your pump, what happens? Your pump starts sucking air, right? And then the pump doesn't work. So we needed to have a site where there was enough water above where we could set a pump that we could recover at the rates we were looking for. And as it turned out, the water level is about 485 feet below ground surface. That is pretty deep. But the aquifer itself is down at 900, and that leaves 430 feet of available drawdown for us. So that was enough. This was the findings from the monitor well, and Ricky and I talked about it, and we said, all right, let's go forward with it. So we drilled a production well. This is a diagram of what the lithology looked like in the bottom of about 200 feet of the well. And you can't read the text on that, but on the left-hand side, what we're showing there is if you see dark colors means shales and clays, and light yellow means sand. So you can see that we found sand at the very bottom of that hole. And then the picture on the right-hand side shows not only did we find sand, but there's also some gravel in there. And usually it's a good thing to find gravel. If it's well-rounded like that, you can see the smooth edges on that gravel. It looks like river rock. And so when you have nice smooth gravels and sands, and you find that at the bottom of your well, that's a good thing for potential yields. So we were feeling kind of optimistic after that. So we put a pump in the production well, and we pumped it. I'm not going to talk through these diagrams too much other than to say they are a perfect representation of an aquifer test, and I've used them in classes that I teach, and so I just had to put them on a slide because I'm so proud of them. But what it comes out to is we're trying to estimate the productivity of the aquifer, the hydraulic properties that will tell us how much water the well can make and what the drawdown is going to be over the long term. And so we were able to produce about 250 gallons a minute with a test pump. We think the max would be about 400 gallons per minute. And given we only started with 60 feet of sand in a pretty shallow aquifer, I was basically turning cartwheels at the time. I didn't actually turn cartwheels because I'm 50, but I would have been turning cartwheels could I turn cartwheels. So we came out of this, and everything was looking pretty optimistic, pretty hopeful from this. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about going forward, having found what we found, and we think we can make 400 gallons a minute, and we found out the aquifer properties. What do we do next? Aquifer storage and recovery hydraulics means you know that if you're pumping a well and the water level, I'm going to say it again, gets down to the pump, you start sucking air, that's bad, it burns out your pump. So you have a constraint on how much you can draw a well down, and that's on the right-hand side. You can draw down water from where the water level is in the aquifer down to the top of your well, or top of your pump, sorry, and that's a constraint. But think about when you're recharging, you have the same restraint, but it's in reverse. When you're putting water in the well, the water rises up in the well casing. And if you don't seal up your casing, then you're going to get water running around on the ground at the casing. So we definitely seal the tops, right? But there's a limit to how much you can pressurize that wellhead. And so we have a constraint when we're recharging that we can't put too much pressure at the wellhead. And we have a constraint when we're recovering that we can't draw that water level all the way down past the top of the pump. And those are the constraints we're working with when we're designing a well field to try to achieve the goals for Fort Cavazos. So here's what the modeling looks like, and I'm just going to take you to the graph on the right-hand side. What you're seeing in the middle there, that dotted line, is the static water level. If you can read 400 feet, negative 400, it's just below that. It's where the curve starts. And so that was where our static water level starts out. The dotted line at the bottom is basically the top of the hosta, and that's at 900 feet. So we're starting at about 430, 440, and we're going down to 900. And what we need to do is we need to keep the water level, which is that blue line, in between those two curves when we're recovering, and we don't want to go above zero when we're recharging. And so you can see early on there, the water level goes up while we're recharging, then comes back down. It goes up when we're recharging and then comes back down. And then we try to recover at 2 million gallons per day, and we watch that water level. This is just a simulation. We're not actually doing this out in the field. We're simulating it. And that water level gets down to maybe 700 feet, and that's still 200 feet above the top of our aquifer, so we're fine. We let it recover again, and then that big spike you see at the end at the 4 MGD recovery, that's when we're really pulling on our well field. And when we pull on it at 4 MGD, we're dipping below 900 feet. And what does that mean? That means that we're going to dry out our pumps, and we're not successful at getting 4 MGD. Now, does that mean that the whole thing, that we got to mothball the whole thing? No, it doesn't. That just means that this initial design that I'm simulating isn't quite right. It's good for 2 MGD, but it's not quite right for 4 MGD. So what the team is doing is we're working on getting the well locations in the right place. I think I saw Alan here from CDM. He's helping with Intera and Dave Smith, and we're all just working to get the wells laid out and make sure that we can get a successful withdrawal of 4 MGD. So we're right in the middle of all that right now. But again, I'm hopeful that this is going to be successful. And this is just a picture of what the contours look like around this hypothetical well field. Again, we haven't drilled the well field yet, but you can see that when you have a well field, a line of wells like we're showing here, the contours tend to coalesce around the well. But what I like seeing is that as we move a few miles away to the south or to the north, we're seeing that there's a lot less impacts than around the well field. We have to be cognizant of people with existing wells around the fort. And even though the fort has a lot of land, you can have impacts that spread quite a ways away from your well field. So again, we're thinking of safety, we're thinking of other people's wells, and we really want to know whether we're going to have impacts to those wells as part of these operations. All right, so what's next steps on this? We're going to develop a 30% well field design, which basically means we're getting to the point where we can give Brian and the fort the numbers and say, this is how much we think this thing's going to cost. And then Fort Cav and WCID number 1, they need to decide whether it makes sense economically for them to proceed. There's a lot of attraction to the fort to having this source of stored water for their resiliency, right? If you're in the military, you want resiliency, and this would give them the potentially, emergency water supply or drought water supply. So, obviously they're motivated to make it happen, but if it doesn't money out with your taxpayer dollars, they're not going to do it. So we're right at the part right now where we're getting the costs right to get a proposal in front of them to see whether they want to proceed. Okay, I'm at about 22. That's just right. Okay. So let's move to the east, to the temple site. So again, we go from west to east. We get deeper. The units get thicker. The wells should get more productive. And I'm showing that cross-section again, and in the red circle would be a typical well. So instead of drilling 1,000 feet, now your backyard driller can probably go 1,000 feet with a small rig. Your backyard driller cannot go to 2,500 feet with a small rig. There's only a couple of drillers in Texas. I don't know how many bid for Billy's job, but it was probably 2 or 3 that could achieve this. And so it's definitely a bigger rig. It's a different kind of driller that's going to drill this kind of well because it's so deep. The objectives here were to construct a Lower Trinity well, providing a water supply for an industrial partner for the city of Temple called Rowan. So they're basically building a data center and they need water for cooling. The well was to be constructed to meet UIC, so underground injection control. That's a division of the TCEQ requirements for ASR. So it's worked with Billy when he was designing the well to make sure that we would future-proof this well, so not only could it be a production well for a data center, but potentially we could flip it around, turn it into an ASR well in the future. The main thing was an upgrade in the casing material to high-strength low-alloy steel, and that's for corrosion protection. We performed an ASR feasibility study in parallel with well construction, just basically proving out some of the things that I talked about for Fort Cav, and there's a potential to convert this well to ASR in the future using recycled water as a source. But right now, it's just a production well. So pilot hole findings, I want to thank Vince Claus. I don't know if Vince is still here. He was here before, but he put together these beautiful chip tray photos. Chip trays are when you take every 10 feet or 20 feet or whatever while you're drilling, and you lay them out in this nice tray. But what we're seeing down at the bottom again is we're seeing gravel. So I don't know if I'm just lucky because I've drilled a lot of bad wells in my life, but these two that I were associated with both had gravel at the bottom. And so maybe I should just quit now while I'm ahead, but let's, let's just say we're feeling good about it. But you see that size gravel at the bottom over large intervals, then Billy was feeling pretty good. It was going to be productive, and so was I. So the next thing to do is test it. It was tested at over 2,000 gallons a minute. If you recall at Fort Cab, we thought maybe 400, so we're looking at nearly an order of magnitude 10 times here for 2,000 gallons a minute. We estimated transmissivity at 11,000 feet squared per day, which won't mean anything to most of you, but just that's a high transmissivity. And basically, when we plotted on the map, you can see where that red arrow is, and we plotted it with the results of a long-term pump test that had been led by Joe Yellerman. Is Joe out here still? There's Joe. Yeah, so he did this long-term 30-day pump test and estimated transmissivities around the pumping well, which was at Trinity Oasis. And what I like to see is that our 82,000 gallons per day per foot fits in really nice with all the estimates that he had made of transmissivity, which means I feel pretty good about what the overall transmissivity is in this area. So what's the impact of having a large area of your aquifer that has high transmissivity? Well, you can either go put a bunch of wells in there and really pump a lot of water out of the aquifer, or you can put a big ASR well field in that area and you can recharge a lot of water into the aquifer. And that's where this could potentially fit in with that larger sort of regional strategy that you guys heard about earlier. That's how this particular technique might fit into that regional strategy, is using this very productive portion of the aquifer as a storage zone for water that's either treated here, and you know, when we get storms, when we get excess water from the lakes here, or water that's imported. And that's how I'm trying to kind of tie all this together, bring in the science into the picture to potentially support that coalition that's being formed here for a regional alliance. All right, and just a quick kind of finish it up, I wanted to talk about comparison and costs. What you're seeing there in that graph is called the Universal Costing Model from the Texas Water Development Board. Basically what we did, I say we because I helped develop this part for the Water Board. We went and got bids from all the drillers. We got all our old bids, and a lot of folks helped out. Mike Keister, who got mentioned earlier, I don't know if he's here, but he helped gather the data for this from the wells that he had drilled. And we put them all on a graph, and we try to figure out, based on two different characteristics, what a typical well is going to cost. The two characteristics are the depth of the well, and everybody knows that's important. But the other thing is the well yield. And the reason for that is because as your yield goes up, your casing diameter goes up. So it gets to be a bigger well, meaning more casing materials, more expensive to drill, larger bits, larger machines, all that. So the correlation is pretty strong between those two factors. And using that, we can kind of estimate what we think the Fort Cavazos wells may cost and what we think the Temple wells are going to cost. And so Fort Cavazos comes in at right around $1 million for a single well. That doesn't mean that if we drilled 6 wells, they'd each cost $1 million. You get economies of scale once you get the drill rig out there. So my hope would be that they'll come in less than that. We won't know until we bid it out. You move over to the east near Temple, you got a lot higher productivity and a lot deeper wells. As I said, there are fewer contractors that can actually drill them. And so you're looking in around maybe $3 million a well. Again, if you drill a bunch of them, you'll get some economies of scale, but you know, if you don't do them this year, by next year, they'll be 3.5. Things are moving real fast now in the drilling space, and things are getting more expensive. So that's just kind of a ballpark idea, giving you an idea of what the difference in the cost would be between those two sites. Now, obviously, when you're spending $3 million on the well, you're getting a lot more water out of that well. So the cost per yield is actually pretty similar between the two sites. I think that's all I had. That's all I had. So there's my email, and man, I really appreciate your patience and attention after lunch, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
Is there any questions? We have a few moments before our next speaker. If you all would like to ask Neil, there's a. I can't see who it is, Scott, but I think he asked the question a year ago, if I'm thinking. Yeah, he's the guy with the shiny head like me. There you go.
I live out east, and my concern was as far as you're going to be injecting under pressure, as far as private wells that are nearby. are old abandoned wells. Is there an issue as far as getting water up those wells, kind of like they're having in West Texas, where they're doing the brine injection and they're shooting into the sky?
Yeah, so I think that if I'm understanding it right, if you have a well that's poorly completed and it's in the area that's being influenced by the aquifer, by the ASR well field, as you're recharging, then obviously the pressure in the aquifer is increasing around that well field. It does dissipate as you move away from it, as I kind of show with those contours. But yeah, if you have a really poorly constructed well, as with anything, if you're producing or recharging, you have the potential for the water moving across. Now, the difference between that and an oil well is that you're recharging water that's of better quality than the aquifer itself. So the water itself doesn't add any danger. I guess you're going to find out, though, if you have some poorly constructed wells that are nearby. Yeah?
And our role in this situation is to identify where wells are at, and if there is any abandoned wells, we're pretty sophisticated in our capacity to do that, Murray. And in this particular case, we would be looking for Lower Trinity wells. And I think Ricky Garrett was committed to us making sure that there was a radius of understanding from the wells on Fort Cavazos. The same with Temple. Temple, there is some wells a little closer in the same formation. There's an old legacy well that's in great shape, been reconditioned by Billy Gamblin for the VA hospital. And then there's East Bell has a well close. And we actually have a monitor well very close that they used for the pump test. So there is, what they're finding though, the depth and thickness of the aquifer there, the magnitude of moving left and right, the column's going to go more so vertically, and so then that would be a plus. So and Murray, full disclosure, Murray asked you the question last year about quality. I didn't know if you were here until I saw your head, Murray. I recognized you. That smile is really what I recognize, not your head, but I can make fun. It's great. Any more questions for Neil? If not, he's going to. We have an additional one. Yeah.
So. When you're putting oxygenated water back down in the well, do you have any issues with hazardous materials that are bonded coming back out in the water?
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. So what I didn't dig into is geochemistry, which is another part of the science that you really have to get right. Now, we don't expect that we're going to get mobilization of things in the Trinity itself. It's been successfully done in other places, but that doesn't mean that we don't do a demonstration well and really make sure that that's true before we scale out the well field. So it's a great point. It's something we do consider. Yeah.
And the gentleman sitting to your left or right there, it's his fault we have the regulatory framework to prevent just what you were saying, which is Lyle. You asked that question many, many times of TCEQ. Those are some of the metrics that he demanded in the legislation through the permitting process. I blame you for all that regulation. And it's not onerous, it's just responsible. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi everybody. Bill Grace from Mustang Creek. My question is just decommissioning of a well like this, the Lower Trinity, and they're under so much higher pressure than, say, the Middle Trinity, and worrying me personally about if there would be some bleed out from the Lower Trinity with much higher solids going into the Middle Trinity, and how long would one of these Lower Trinity wells, the piping, everything, how long is it good for, and will it degrade and possibly leach out into the Middle Trinity?
So he's talking more about the Hammond.
Yeah.
As it confined.
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, let's just see what we have in this cross section here. So what we have a pretty good separation between the Middle Trinity and Lower Trinity in the Hammett Shale. And so the Hammett Shale, at least in the area where Temple is very competent and very thick. I'm not super familiar with your particular area, but we are confident in the area, both of the areas where we're going, that there's enough isolation between those two intervals that you will not get migration of the lower Trinity water into the middle Trinity. Now, if your well is poorly constructed and it acts as a conduit between the two, then that would be a concern. Those wells should be plugged, though, if you have that kind of poor quality. You ask how long a well lasts? 50 years if you design them right.
That's a good question, Bill. Good example is your personal well has degraded and is communicating between the upper Trinity and the middle Trinity, as we had a conversation. Your concern is these lower Trinity wells, there is a combining layer where one is allowed to communicate because of poor construction. That's what you get, lower quality, you get a blending of the two. It's a complex question. Where you're at, we know from the initial information we've seen for the Mustang Springs well, their consultants are here. Actually, the table to your left is Brad Cross and Hunter King. They are the ones who've completed that well to the lower Trinity and has been able to document, because that's part of the process. Is there enough confinement, and is the well being completed properly in those areas? So then our job is to work with Keister, our consultant, talking with them, looking over their shoulder to assure those kinds of things. The other thing we know is poor construction. If it takes too long and the mud is circulated, it seals off the water bearing. The blessing is that gravel you see, if I have a bottle of water, if I have a big old jar and I fill it with gravel as big as this or marbles or whatever, water's going to move around in there quite easily. In the western side where you guys are at, that's pretty sandy and it's not quite the gravel in that lower formation, and so the productivity doesn't even approach what these other two wells he's looked at, because you're compartmentalized in a faulted area. As Representative Buckley says, it's a beautiful place to live. Mother Nature never blessed you guys with good groundwater. It just didn't happen. And then it's overcommitted because there's no public water supply in that area, especially those using it from the south. Any other questions? So before we move to where? Oh, go ahead. Sandra, are you asking a question? Not yet, I don't think.
No.
How many acre
Questions?
feet do you think you'd be able to store in that well in Temple?
It really has to do more with the availability of water and the time you have to store it. I mean, that's 2,000 gallons a minute is about 3,000 acre feet per year. So if you could store at that rate, that's about 3,000 acre feet per year per well. And you don't have to just do one well. You could put many in if you were doing a well field.
It would have to be separate wells to go over 3,000 acre feet?
It would scale at about that rate. That's right.
All right, thanks.
So just from a visual standpoint, you saw where he had 6 for Fort Cavazos in that design. So if Temple was to, in their industrial park, because they own all the water rights there, that land was not sold to the city of Temple. So if they put 10 wells in annually, they could put upwards of 30,000 acre feet a year. Very similar to what's being done in a bigger magnitude in Saws down there at the desal plant and their ASR. Does that make sense? Am I correct?
Yep,
Okay.
you're right. You got it.
So,